I'm very happy to be here with you. I mean, you said a bit about your own activities, and I think it's so important to create that connect also with people across borders, across generations. Now, you asked me to say something about the crisis, and then you made the reference to the Silicon Valley Bank and to Credit Suisse. I mean, for me, I must frankly speaking say, and maybe someone in the audience that are listening in now have a similar feeling. If you think about what we know, the uncertainty that we experience now, and if we think back about the Euro crisis, in my feeling it is that the Euro crisis in a way felt way more existential and in a way more threatening. And everyone, again, she or he has his own experience in how you perceive this and what was the threat, the risk at the time. For me, it largely meant kind of endless emergency meetings, long calls, and that was actually before we had Zoom, before we had video calls, so long phone calls and hasty country visits in order to put together measures. So, and the point is that I want to make is that this nowadays feels less existential because we are much better prepared to weather a crisis. So I think we are much more resilient. And that has to do with the ESM. So when the Euro crisis hit the Euro area, it was essentially that the great financial crisis swapped over from the US and affected our financial system. And that then was combined with vulnerabilities, problems we had built up in Europe. And this mixture of different problems, shocks that occurred, basically led to the fact that financial stability reached such a degree that there was a danger that a country would have to leave the Euro area. And the big problem at the time was that essentially we had no backstop, no lender of last resort for a sovereign. And I guess you all can imagine if a country, a government, a state runs into problems in financing itself in markets, that means you cannot spend, in the extreme, money on wages or on pensions or on healthcare or on investment. And that actually kind of pulls the ground off many elements in the economy. And this was the risk at the time. And that was the reason why the EFSF is a temporary facility, the European Financial Stability Facility, and later on the European Stability Mechanism, where we are now, where I am now, were created in order to address that problem and create this lender of last resort for a sovereign. And the way member states did it and thought about it is essentially that they pooled resources in order to create essentially a safe institution, an institution that would be able to borrow money in the market with a great degree of credibility. And essentially they pooled more than 700 billion of capital in order to do so, and for us to borrow on the market and on-lend that money to countries that have lost market access and that were running into trouble. And that is what we did. So we could take up markets with great credibility at a relatively favorable rate and on-lend that money to countries. And we did it between 2011 and 2018 for 5 countries. We did it for Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Cyprus, and Greece. And altogether about 300 billion in loans that we gave to those countries. But it's not that you only provide, so to speak, credit or favorable financing. That gives countries a lot of fiscal space. But on top of that, that money comes with a need to reform the country, to take policy measures that essentially help to regain market access. And that was also what we did in those programs. And with those measures, actually, we found that countries afterwards were able to grow at high rates and get out of their problems. So they regained market access, regained growth, and could catch up again. Overall, we have used those 300 billion. And at this stage, we have a lending capacity of 400 billion remaining. And that obviously is also a good thing to know for the current situation and for the future. Now, when we look a bit more specifically into those cases and what we did during those years with the countries, it turns out that the programs that we had with the different countries were very different. And here comes the point that essentially what ESM is an efficient firefighter. We try to address the problem at hand. For Greece, the structural problems were very deep, and therefore the country needed quite some time to address that, and a lot of measures. And because it took quite some time, also a lot of financing during that time period. For Spain, the situation was very different. And in Spain, there was basically the banking sector that needed to be reformed, reshaped, addressed. And that is what we provided financing for, which was less than in the case of Greece, for example, and more targeted. And more recently, in the pandemic, we came up with a pandemic support facility, and that essentially had no macro conditionality, and it basically only asked countries to use the money for what was needed at the time, which was healthcare expenditures. And this is the way how we try to tailor our instruments in order to be efficient and support countries for what they need. Now, you may be asking yourself, the last program that you see on this table here is actually goes till 2018. So we have now 2023. What happened in the meantime? And what are we doing now? And for me, essentially, as a firefighter, you don't need to be actively fighting a fire all the time, but you need to be prepared. And you need to take care of those programs that you actually deployed at the time. So at this stage, what we do, I told you before, we have a lot of capital. So we have 80 billion of paid-in capital that we have to dutifully administer for member states in order to back our creditworthiness. We have those outstanding loans that partly run for a very long time period that we have to take care of, and let's look that they actually paid back, and we monitor this very closely. And the third element is that we are preparing and working towards our new mandate. And as it actually turns out, member states thought that the ESM could be even more effective, more efficient in its role as firefighter by adding elements to our mandate. The one element is that they wanted us to be more preventive, and it's very clear. If you act preventively, you may avoid the big trouble, so to speak. You may avoid the big crisis, which would be more costly to resolve. And that is why our instruments were somewhat adjusted. And we were also given the task in that new mandate to monitor risks as they emerge in the euro area. The second element is, and here we come also to the question of banking, is that the ESM is envisaged to be the common backstop to the Single Resolution Fund. Among the institutions that were created in Europe to address problems in the banking sector is the Single Resolution Board, and that board has a fund that can help and that one can use when a bank has to be resolved. And we are a backstop to that fund. So we add more credibility to Europe's ability to deal with banking crisis. The new mandate is basically ratified in all member states but one, and we hope that happens soon, and then we can put this fully into place. Obviously, I have talked a lot about the ESM because also you asked me to do so, and I think it's important to understand the ESM as a cornerstone of the European crisis structure. But we are obviously not acting alone. Actually, over the past decade, we have built up different pillars of reactions of institutions that help to address crisis. And here you see in the middle, it's rescue mechanisms, and here it's the ESM as a permanent institution. But in the past crisis, there was also an ad hoc mechanism, SURE, that was put into place in order to support the unemployment schemes and keep people on the job. We have obviously the European Central Bank that has developed its toolbox in order to address crisis, fragmentation, and make markets work. And then also the single supervisor as one of the arms of the ESM, of the European Central Bank, in order to make the banking system safer. And the final pillar that is shown in this picture is what the EU has done to support growth, to support structural change. And this is, of course, particularly important nowadays when we also talk about climate change, when we talk about the need to change our energy mix. And here are a number of projects and programs, and above all, the so-called Next Generation EU, in order to help countries to deal with this challenge in the long run. So I think, if you remember where we were at the start, with this crisis, the euro crisis, that felt more existential, and you look at the institutional structure that we have now, I hope you can now a bit understand the role that ESM plays, and also why it feels less existential. And I think I can leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer any questions.